So, gaming has existed for a very long time, and after every year passes, it becomes a little bit more difficult for you to play some of these cult classics that go on to be called genre shaping titles. Companies oftentimes try and preserve these older titles through various different methods to give them to new gamers. So, today we're going to talk about remasters and remakes. So let's get into what remasters and remakes actually are. Remasters are basically just putting up the graphical fidelity of your game to match it to reach a wider audience now than it had in the past. Basically, we used to play on TVs like this, and now we play on TVs like this, so naturally a game should go from looking like that to that. Pretty simple. Remakes, on the other hand, are taking maybe a few previous assets from the old game and then remaking the whole game. You know what? You can't use the word when giving a definition for a word. So let's try this again. Remakes, on the other hand, are reimagining. I can get away with reimagining. Y'all gonna let me get away with that one. Are reimaginings of older games put in whatever different playstyle or mechanics. For example, like a remake would be the Ratchet and Clank games now compared to ones before. There are very similar motifs, but obviously there can be serious changes in the story, there can be serious changes in what happens to characters, and you're not buying a carbon copy from one game to another. They have to be different on either a mechanical perspective or a story perspective. Something of the content of the game has to be different. I'm not just talking like additions, I'm talking about like in the actual core of the game. So, and before I even get into this, let me make it very clear what remasters are for and what they aren't for. Remasters are literally seen only to help newer players who may not have been around or been alive or been into gaming when the first game that they remastered is being, graphically updated. It isn't made for old time fans to rebuy it. That is literally like an afterthought when a lot of companies are making these games. So oftentimes there will be differences between the two games that may or may not make or break it for older fans, such as the Super Mario Collection having more input delay or running off of an emulator. So naturally they also have like a lower budget than, an actual remake, which means that oftentimes remasters will be riddled with bugs or little input errors on release that the companies can decide whether or not it's doing well enough for them to even think about patching it or anything. So to put it simply, remakes are changes to a game's mechanics while remasters are changes to a game's graphics. So you're asking, why am I making this video? Why do I need to care what remasters and remakes are? And, well, you don't, one, but I do. So I'm gonna tell you why I do. And it's basically because remasters are boring. Like, I don't care for remasters because I know it's not for my intended audience. But even then, a lot of remasters aren't definitively the best version of any game unless they are bringing something that wasn't in the previous game allowed to that region. For example, the Kingdom Hearts 2.5 collection. 2.5 itself isn't necessarily a better version of Kingdom Hearts 2. It has more pixels, it has more graphics, but at the same time it also has more problems, like loading between drive forms. But while it also brings those problems, it now let gamers that couldn't previously play the Japanese exclusive super bosses, now they have a chance to. So that remaster, in my opinion, is more geared towards being good because it leaves with extra content. However, a lot of remasters aren't like that. They're hella boring, very shallow copies of original games, and some of them just plain don't work because they're not really given assets to make these games into their own thing. So for a lot of people, myself included, remakes are often going to be a little bit more interesting than remasters because they bring something new to the game. However, unfortunately, remakes kind of suck too, because remakes are in an interesting place where the developer of the game doesn't want to make the game too different from the original because they still want to appeal to the older people that used to play their games, but they also don't want to make it too crazy for newcomers because they also want to appeal to newcomers that have maybe never played the game before. So they want to make it a mix between the two. But let me stop you right there, because very rarely has I seen something that tries to appeal to multiple demographics do well, in terms of gaming at least. It's never good, because you should have a focus. A lot of the greatest games ever made were made focusing on their positives rather than, trying to hide their weaknesses. And whether or not that speaks for them being a great game is subjective, but it definitely makes it more interesting and enjoyable. That is until RE2 Remake came out. Thought instead to be a remake of Resident Evil 2 in the Resident Evil 4 style. And to classify this is really difficult because, in my opinion, this is when a remaster becomes a remake. And after seeing it was in the style of Resident Evil 4, the hype kind of died down for me, because Resident Evil 4 had games based off of it before, Resident Evil 5 and 6, which were fun games but never really quite reached the same level of enjoyment that Resident Evil 4 unanimously brought to so many people. And that's when, once again, Resident Evil 2 Remake surprised me, because instead of it trying to be just a copy of Resident Evil 4 with the aesthetic and location of Resident Evil 2, it instead tried to be more and tried to innovate again by having zombies have more health and having them feel more like a threat than they ever were in Resident Evil 4. This was a great redemption story to me, because it really communicated to me for the first time that maybe all remakes weren't so bad, or maybe if they had a vision and some extra time and weren't just trying to make a penny off of nostalgia, they could actually be something good. Resident Evil 2 Remake to this day still stands as one of the best remakes ever made, and it does so much for the series because it took a style that was so well claimed, Resident Evil 4, and in my opinion improved it in a way that, look, they're about to make a Resident Evil 4 remake based off of Resident Evil 2 Remake. So the fact that they're making a remake based off of a game that already exists because the other remake did really good says a lot about Resident Evil 2 Remake. But with every great rise eventually comes a fall. And let me preface this before I even start talking about it, but RE3 Remake is still one of the better examples of remakes being made for games in recent times. However, RE3 Remake signifies a trend, and unfortunately, it's not just a Capcom trend, but we could get into that. That's a whole different conversation. Okay, RE3 Remake had a significantly shorter development cycle than RE2 Remake. And that is alarming, because you would think that for a series that did so well, or for a title that did so well as a remake, that they would put more time and energy into it, but unfortunately, that's not the case. Remakes had such a golden example of what they should strive to be, and rather than this being a video on hating Resident Evil 3 Remake, I want it to be a video on promoting other remakes to be as ambitious as Resident Evil 2 Remake. I want to see more remakes for games. If they're genuinely going to bring something interesting to the table, I want to see less remasters, I want to see more remakes, but have them actually be interesting and be more than just remasters with a little extra content. That's boring. So many things are boring. And look, if we're really gonna get into it, gaming definitely has a better track record of doing better with reboots and remasters than various other mediums, whether it be books, movies, TV shows. I mean, look, they're making a Powerpuff Girls live action TV show, which, who asked for that, but I digress. So it'd be so cool to see a lot of companies actually have faith in remaking their game. Because if, like I said before, I'm not really asking for a game to be good, I'm just asking for a game to be different. And whether or not that game is good once it's different isn't their job. And I'll be entirely honest with that. And whether you want to disagree with me or say, well, a bad game is a bad game, I'd rather play a bad game than a boring game. And all you're gonna get from a remake is a boring game, because people are still gonna compare it to the old game. So, do better, I guess.